Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Vampir has requested some discussion about some homebrew magic items for their Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition game. Vampir says, there was one or a couple semi-recent Parley about reviewing D&D homebrew spells. It's very fun to listen to, and played a role in me recently, deciding to get Parley myself, so my Parley for this month will be more 5e homebrew shenanigans. Linked above are two Bloodborne designs I've made into +1 magic weapons. Couple questions after looking them over. Do purely martial characters that wouldn't normally access spells in D&D, like want/warrant/need the increased combat options that weapons like these would offer? Movement without opportunity attacks or granting your allies next attack advantage are functionally utility from low-level spells. If you can't tell, this is going to be a pretty game design-focused parlay. Do you think either of the transforming attacks on these two are overcomplicated? Reaction attack from the bow, having multiple possible triggers, for example, even if shooting a guy in response to them casting a spell sounds insanely cool. And would you hand your players a magic item like this which consolidates two weapons? D&D 5e is a little complicated on what your hands are wielding and what it takes to attack with or draw multiple weapons, and it also doesn't have a lot of mechanical incentives to have all three physical damage types on your person, just in case a monster needs to be slashed or flattened. Cool, very targeted, great questions. Let's read the two items and start. But basically these questions are about, like game balance and the game design of adding weapons that give spells to classes, the whole defining trait of which is that they do not have spells, which I think is a great, very targeted question. My short answer is no, I don't think that's a good idea, but I have a lot more to say about it, of course. I have a pretty low opinion of magic items, personally. I think they're for a sort of different style of play than most people's 5th edition game is, than most of the book adventures kind of are. I feel like they don't really make sense in current D&D in the way they're often applied, but I'll talk about why I think that. Let's read the two homebrew items. Okay, so and they're Bloodborne items. So Bloodborne, right? A lot of the weapons are kind of trick weapons. They're two weapons in one. They're a gun and then something else, or multiple different kinds of melee weapons. So we're expecting something like that. That's cool. Okay, the first one's called Simon's Bowblade. Simon's Bowblade is a trick weapon that functions as both a one-handed sword and a short bow by splitting its curved blade down the middle, revealing a tight bowstring. You can use your bonus action to transform the weapon between a +1 scimitar and a +1 short bow. Additionally, you can use your action to perform a transforming attack with the weapon, which both transforms it and performs a unique maneuver based on which form you're initially wielding. When transformed, whether through a transforming attack or by use of bonus action, the weapon stays in its new form until transformed again. So you follow us so far. The transforming attack isn't an attack, it's an action that you take. So if you had multi-attack, you have to forfeit that to do the transforming attack, the way it's currently written. Okay. One transforming attack just happened in my mouth. With the scimitar, you make a melee attack against a creature within 5 feet of you. On a hit, the target falls prone. Hit or miss until the start of your next turn, you can use a reaction to make a range attack with your newly transformed short bow against any creature within 80 feet that attempts to make an opportunity attack or stand up from being prone, or when they cast the spell as an optional rule. When performing a transforming attack with the short bow, you make a ranged attack against a creature within 5 feet of you. It doesn't have disadvantage for being within 5 feet. It does additional piercing damage. Additionally, the next attack roll made against the target before the start of your next turn has advantage. And then it lists stats for the two weapons, but basically they're the stats for a scimitar and a short bow. I don't particularly think there's a need to go through those. Let's go over this one first, just from a balance perspective. We'll address the individual questions after we go over both weapons. I do think the transforming attacks read as very wordy. Like, that's a lot of abilities on a weapon. If they were very simple, I think it could work. I think you'd need to, for me to be sold on the complexity load of giving a player this weapon, and I'll kind of explain more about that in a minute, I think you would need to make the transforming attacks be so simple that maybe you're not interested in them, but I still think it could be appealing. The idea is that the scimitar transforming attack is you have a sword out, you kind of hit the guy, and if you hit, they get knocked prone, and you get to retreat and do a sort of reactive shot at someone. Because you're now in bow mode. You're kind of disengaging from scimitar mode into bow mode. From a tactical perspective and a flavor perspective, I'm totally on board with that. Like, that's cool. And then the short bow one, you've got the bow and you make a point blank shot because you're transitioning into sword mode. Again, tactical and kind of flavor perspective, totally on board. That makes total sense. I think that the short bow one is the one I like better. You just get to make a range attack against a foe within 5 feet without having disadvantage for making a range attack on a foe within 5 feet, and then it becomes a scimitar. That to me seems like enough, actually. First of all, I think this is probably just more powerful than is necessary. Overpowered is a hard thing to capture in a role-playing game where the power level is always mutable. You could always just make the game more powerful, more challenging in response to a player being given this weapon. So I don't think saying it's overpowered means anything, really. Although you could reference other features and, would the player bother using anything else if they got this and it did this much damage? But I do think it's good enough to be worth using with less power, which in my mind means it would be a better design if it was less powerful. In other words, the transforming attack with the short bow, if that did no extra damage and didn't give you additional advantage, just let you make a range attack while you're holding a short bow without disadvantage, and then you end up with a scimitar at the end, that's already good in some situations. I don't think it needs to do more than that. And having it be that the scimitar transforming attack, you make an attack, if it hits, they fall prone, and maybe you get to leave their space without opportunity attacks, that's already quite strong. Like, that lets you back off. That's very good already. And it would take way less space. Like, it's way less text. I'm also keen to just not allow the player to transform the weapon without the transforming attack. Like, or you could say it's a bonus action, but yeah, I guess that's fine. You could leave it that way. But realistically, I think the player won't, except out of combat or when initiative hasn't begun. So I don't know, I'm just trying to cut down on words, but I guess that's not really necessary anymore. Yeah. So I like the idea. I'm just collecting my thoughts a bit. From a conceptual perspective, I'm quite sold on the sort of tactical advantages of this weapon. I think it is unnecessarily powerful, which isn't necessarily bad. We'll talk about that in a moment. The short version of what I have to say about that basically is it really depends who you're giving this weapon to, whether it would be maybe good, but I think probably bad for it to have this level of power. We'll get back to that after we do the other one, and then we'll go through the questions. Okay, the next one is called the Hunter Axe. The Hunter Axe is a trick weapon that transforms between a battle axe and a halberd by extending its handle. You can use your bonus action to transform it. Blah, blah, blah. It works the same way as the other one. When you perform a transforming attack with the battle axe, you can move 5 feet in any direction without provoking opportunity attacks, and then make a melee attack against any creature within 10 feet of you. So this is when you go from battle axe to halberd. You gain reach, so you get to make a kind of opportunity attack avoiding step, and then do a sweep with the halberd, which has better range than the axe. So the idea here would be, I've got an opponent 5 feet in front of me, I back up, transform into halberd mode, don't take opportunity attacks, and do a sweep and hit them when I'm outside their range. Again, very simple. I love how that one is way less wordy, very trimmed down, and it's still clearly powerful enough. Like, that's strong. Like, that is a good effect. When performing a transforming attack with the halberd, you may make melee attacks against any number of creatures, each exactly 10 feet away from you, with a separate attack roll for each target. Whoa, you get to do a sweep. I think for the sake of brevity in combat, I would probably make the player make it as one roll, but I that's fine if you don't care about that. It's got the stats for the weapon. It has the stats of a battle axe and a halberd, pretty much. Cool. One quick note, it's something I really like about both of these. Because the transforming attacks are very strong, you're providing both a benefit to transform. You want to use both versions of the weapon, even if it wouldn't normally benefit you to use both types of weapon, because the transforming attacks are strong effects. And two, I think it encourages a player with a non-ridiculous multi-attack, like that just has extra attack or something, and would normally make 2 attacks. It encourages them to not always default to just using extra attack, which I think is interesting for the right player. This is the part of the parlay where I'm going to get into my sort of game design philosophy about yes, no, these complicated weapons. I guess this is basically your first question. You said, do purely martial characters that would normally access spells in D&D, like want, warrant, need, the advanced combat options that weapons like these would offer? Movement without opportunity attacks or granting your ally next attack advantage are functionally utility from low-level spells. They are. Now, 5th edition's design is essentially that if you want complexity, you pick a spellcaster. Like, that's an oversimplification, but 5th edition's answer to the player doesn't have enough to do in combat or they want more to do in combat is they pick a spellcaster. And its answer to the player is overwhelmed and wants less to manage in combat is you play a martial character or you don't change your spells very much, basically. Which I don't like that design decision. Like, I think that's a bad design decision. It doesn't, players don't think of it that way. That is true about 5th edition in a lot of ways, I would argue, but a lot of players don't actually do that, I don't think. And that results in the game not trying to manage complexity in a way players don't actually act, basically. However, there are a lot of ways that 5th edition, with its bloat, with how much is in it, has adapted to that. So, for example, there are a lot of martial classes that have a lot of complexity. You know, you can play a spellcaster, you can play an arcane trickster or an eldritch knight, and have a lot of spellcasting and still have all the martial stuff, which is a lot of stuff. Especially the rogue thing. You're a skill monkey and you have a bunch of spells and you have the martial stuff. You know, it's a lot. So don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say you can't play a martial character in 5th edition that blah, blah, blah. Let's not worry about that too much. But you get the point I'm trying to make. Most martial characters made very straightforwardly are the kind of simple option in 5th edition. So there's kind of two things that result from that. The first one is that if the player wants a simple option and picks a martial character, it's almost like by definition they don't want like a weapon that has some additional mechanic added to it. Or you could flip it around and say D&D isn't clear enough that that is kind of the intent of some martial characters. So if the player just wants to play a barbarian but is interested in many options in combat and D&D just kind of fails them on that front, you can then kind of fix that by giving them a weapon that has a bunch of features. There are other ways too, like feats to gain maneuvers. I think that the warrior subclass that gives you all those different maneuvers, which somehow the name of which is escaping me, but you know what I'm talking about if you've played 5th edition. There's a warrior subclass that has things like disarming people and bait and switch and parry and all these things that for a certain type of playgroup, maybe that just shouldn't be a subclass and martial characters should just kind of have those things. For the right table, that might just be more fun. But you can take a feat that gives you a few of those. So it's not like there aren't solutions already. And you could argue that magic items, magic weapons are kind of the way you can add that complexity if you want to. I just personally feel like that's very awkward from a design perspective. 5th edition doesn't do a lot to help guide the DM and the players through to finding the level of complexity that they want. It just kind of assumes some things that don't actually line up with reality in my experience. So do weapons that have these abilities make sense from a game design perspective? I would argue they really don't. Like it's not an ideal game design tool. That being said, that makes it kind of a good homebrew tool, I guess, right? Like if you know your playgroup and this works for your playgroup, if you have that need, well, there you go. It clearly does serve that purpose. This is a relatively low-tech way to add complexity to your martial characters. And there might be players who are excited about the unique appeal of gaining a physical weapon with which they will do physical harm to enemies that will have some ability, but they don't know what it is yet, like they get it as loot. Again, you can see how designing your game in such a way that happens, that complicated thing happens to the simpler on paper classes doesn't really make sense. Like you would think spellcasters would probably be interested as well to get an item like that. if that's a fun part of the game where you get loot and it's got a new ability on it, like maybe that should just be a part of the game and not be so specific to spellcasters. But you could argue it is, but I think that's an awkward thing about 5e's design. In any case, is that bad if you want that? No. You also are kind of asking here, I went on about that point for a while, you're kind of asking here, kind of like, is it balanced to give martial characters like a more powerful combat asset like this? And I think it is. A lot of people argue, and I agree, that in 5th edition, spellcasters just are more powerful. It's not very difficult to replicate almost all of the benefits of being a martial character with a spellcaster's spells. For example, a lot of armor class bonuses are sort of bricked by the wizard just casting mage armor, for example. That's a little reductive, but it's unfortunately not as reductive as it could be. It's spellcasters are, you could argue, a little bit overpowered. I would argue that the game has designed into it some kind of power budget, in the idea that not every spellcaster will use their abilities kind of in lockstep and get the most out of spellcasting, but it's not that hard to get a lot out of spellcasting. And so I'm not sure that's a warranted game design decision. It's pretty easy to get a lot of maybe undeserved power as a spellcaster. They're versatile already. Do they really need more raw power? And yet they get it. So I'm just not sure that's entirely warranted. Is it generally going to be, eyeballing it, a good balanced decision to make martial characters a little bit more powerful? Yes, is my answer. Like doing that thing where you give maneuvers to every martial class. Multi-classing aside, I would say you probably don't have to worry too much about the balance implications of that, because spellcasting is so hilariously unbalanced. It feels like that should be fine. And you are basically giving marshals physical spells when you do that. Again, this is all for the right game. Like, just as an aside, there might be players playing a game with the DM where it is understood that you can pick this class as a kind of simpler option. Maybe Barbarian, it kind of works, I guess. And if that's working, then that could be a thing you could leave alone. Really, my point is you'd maybe want to reinforce that, make it even more clear, make it even more true of 5th edition that the martial characters are the kind of simple option if you want that. It's at the moment kind of in limbo. It's a problem, but it isn't really doing the job in either direction, in my opinion. So do I think it's balanced to give martial characters these weapons, even though they're a pretty big power jump? Yes, martial characters are already underpowered, in my opinion. Do I feel like the complexity makes sense? Like, it kind of doesn't, but only in so much as 5th edition already doesn't make sense in that way. So if it fits your game, I suppose. I don't think there is a game design answer for 5th edition. 5th edition's game design opinion about should martial characters have complexity is, don't know, a shrug 5th edition gives you. So I think there's meh. And yeah, I mean, then want, I think the only other thing I have to add that there's just not much to say about, because it'd be about your players basically, is I have a martial character in my campaign right now, and like, he has a build set up. And so if I gave him a weapon like this, well, you could do these things using your action or bonus action or whatever, but he's already got something of value he wants to be doing with those things. So that would give him a tool that makes his build less optimal in a way I could let him change, but that would change a lot of things about his character. That doesn't fit the way that player plays. Like, if your player has kind of a plan of action in combat, you'd have to make sure that this fit that plan of action, or you're sort of nagging at them to change it, is almost how it might feel to a certain kind of player. But that's all totally invalid if your kind of player isn't like that. So I don't know, just something to mention. I kind of answered this one in the process of getting here. You said, do you think either of the transforming attacks on these two are overcomplicated? Yes. In particular, the first one with the bow, I think that's just too much, like unnecessarily bloated. It doesn't need to have that much stuff. It's not an uncool idea. It's possible that maybe it could just be separate, or you could go middle ground. I think these weapons are, as I said in the first question response, these weapons are a good fit for a player that you specifically know wants that, basically. It amounts to, 5th edition isn't helping you much, in my opinion. If you know your player wants a weapon like this, then, well, then it might be a good choice. Now, I think if your player is looking for extra complexity in combat, you should go further, maybe. This is a complicated physical device that they've acquired. It takes time to unlock its full potential. Allow the player to gain basically experience with it. Record when they fight with it during combat. You don't have to do every action, just when they use it in combat and they do the transforming attack at least once or something. And they get an experience point. And when they hit 10, they maybe get added bonuses to the attacks that they've already gotten used to the features of. This helps keep complexity down because they're not actually going to read the entire long now description. They're just adding something to it. They already know what the other part is. They're now just adding, a reaction attack. And it feels cool. It feels like they're gaining even more tactical complexity, which they apparently wanted, which is why you gave them this weapon if you're following my advice. And they hopefully will find that even more exciting. It feels very flavorful, like they learned to use the weapon a certain way. It'll be a great surprise for your other players when the player says, and I see that guy shooting and I used up my trick attack thing, and your party knows that player has no reaction, but then suddenly they shoot and interrupt the guy, and the DM says, yeah, he unlocked the ability to, he learned how to shoot in as a reaction when transforming into the shortbow form, and the party goes, whoa, you got this new ability. That's fun. Maybe I want that. Be prepared for your other players to say they want something similar. But I think if you want all that stuff on it, maybe making that be something your player can earn by using the weapon. Maybe you don't even tell them. Or a feat. You could add a feat for trick weapons that adds additional features to trick weapons, something like that. You could give it a cost, let the player opt in if they want the complexity, or if you know they want it, you could let them unlock it. That could help keep the complexity down in practice while leaving all the features you want if you want it to do all that stuff at once. Personally, though, I think it's kind of unnecessary. I think it depends on the player. Like if the player would just prefer more in that single attack, that's cool. I think it effectively means you're stapling a maneuver onto the transforming attack, which you could give them maneuvers. This entire parlay is really just me trying to sell you on giving you all your marshals maneuvers, but that's fine. I mean, do it. Would you hand your players a magic item like this, which consolidates 2 weapons? Basically, do you think that that's a problem? No, but I have more to say, of course. You say, D&D 5e is a little complicated on what your hands are wielding. I don't think it is. I think that people don't seem to like that mechanic. I actually really do. I don't think it's complicated myself. I think that the addition that is useful, for me anyway, is to think of it this way, basically. The player figures out what's in their hands. Maybe a different character sheet that shows that would be helpful, by the way. I think about World of Warcraft, which I played a lot as a kid, where if you had a 2-handed weapon, it would take up both of your hand slots. And if you had like a dagger and a spell focus, it would take up each of those slots. And you could very visually see, like, this is what's in your hands. Your character would be holding it, etc. But yeah, as long as the player has in mind, if a spell says S for a somatic component, the spell requires some physical motion to perform. My player needs either a free hand or a hand that is holding something that can be used as a spell focus. And generally, I hand wave if the spell specifies you need to perform an action with a reagent. So maybe the spell requires the use of a crystal ball. The player could have a free hand in which we just kind of assume they're holding a crystal ball, even if in combat it would be impractical for them to do that. That's just more immersion than D&D is capable of covering, in my opinion. Or they're holding a spell focus. I generally hand wave, you can use the crystal ball in your pocket, I would generally say. I feel like that's a good middle ground between you need to do exactly what the spell describes you doing, and you need to be very particular about what's in your hands. It's a good middle ground between that and people totally ignore what's in their hands. It's not very hard to keep track of, and it's a very useful balancing component in 5th edition, I think, that adds a bit of immersion without being too complicated, as long as you're a little loose about it. Now, another addition that I think is very useful if you're going to do that is making it so the player can, so they take one free object interaction, they can maybe swap weapons once or, load a weapon once for free. And if they want to do it again, they can spend one of their things on their turn. So I would let the players spend their movement, maybe not all of their movement, or a bonus action or an action. They just spend like an act of some kind of act during their turn to do more. So if the player wants to swap weapons twice, I would say maybe you can't move as much or you don't move at all that turn, but you can. You just have to spend something else. And having that kind of omni-action cost, where it can cost something else in your turn, but it doesn't have to be exactly one thing, allows the player to do more things that it feels like they should be able to do as long as there is some trade-off. I think this is a very simple implementation that lets you cleanly define some value for players doing a lot of complicated stuff with their hands in the middle of 6 seconds of frantic combat without it being at all difficult to rule, basically. As long as they know what's in their hands. Again, I think a slightly different character sheet would go a long way there. And then if they want to change that, they get that once for free. That actually is in D&D 5th edition already. And then an additional time it would require, 5th edition says an action. I think something on your turn is a much better way to do it. Having it require an action means that it is almost always wrong to do more than one object interaction on a turn. You basically lose your turn if you do that. That's essentially always incorrect. It would be better to not even do anything on your turn a lot of the time than to forfeit your entire turn just switching weapons when you could do that for free if you just waited a turn. But a lot of the time the player has some free slot where they can do that. And it really rewards players that have maybe a niche bonus action or use for movement or something that they don't always use, but that they have kind of ready to go. They can cash that in for some minor benefit, manipulating their combat equipment in between rounds maybe. Or I might let a player do something like if you want to throw a stick of dynamite or whatever, I might let my player do that even if their hands are full by spending their bonus action, let's say. If they already use their free object interaction, they can spend some extra attention on their turn to fling it out of their pocket with the hand they're holding their shield with. Like, that seems physically possible as long as you spend some attention on it, that type of maybe a little more relaxed interpretation of what's in your hands, but still using that mechanic is, I think, pretty simple, like not complicated, but still makes it a mechanic in the game. So having said that, I think I would agree with you that D&D doesn't do a very good job defining that. That is mostly actually in I think the DMG. I forget where I read that, but it could definitely be more clear and a little more flexible. That's how I'd recommend doing it. Now that we have, I hope some of you agree, a functional version of using what's in your hands. What do we think about having a magic item that is basically 2 weapons? So you say what it takes to attack with or draw multiple weapons isn't as clear. Hopefully we clarified that. And it also doesn't have a lot of mechanical incentives to use all 3 physical damage types on your person just in case a monster needs to be slashed or flattened. Indeed, I think there really isn't any advantage. Technically there's a little, but very little advantage to having the ability to swap physical damage types in combat. Shouldn't be evaluated as power these weapons gained. In the right game, like, I think that's cool, personally. I feel like that's something that, again, 5th edition kind of doesn't do enough that it's a mechanic. The game heavily features resistances, but it doesn't do it not at all. It just does it the wrong amount for everyone. And I think this is true of a lot of things about 5th edition. It's trying to please everyone at once, which makes it worse at everything than it would be if you tweaked it a little bit. And I would argue that the way 5th edition is currently set up, the one it's closer to is resistances mattering. So I would add resistances. For this type of game, I think this type of game where you have, it's like Bloodborne, it's a little bit like The Witcher, I guess, or a lot of other RPGs, I guess, where enemies are vulnerable to a specific type of damage. That seems like a mechanic that would work well for the right play group. You know your players, right? Like if they will pay attention to that, I would say from a game design perspective, you should do it. Add more resistances. Make every enemy immune to, less tanky against one damage type and more tanky against another physical damage type, and see how it is. And maybe basic enemies with very little health don't do this, because if your players figure out what they're vulnerable to, flicking them with the right damage type will one-shot that enemy. So maybe for like a simple zombie, there's no need to add this. But for, bosses and stuff, make them have a bit more health and make them vulnerable to one of the physical damage types. And I don't think that will play poorly. I think that'd be cool. And as long as your players bring two options, it's kind of rock, paper, scissors. Like they'll break even on damage as long as they swap weapons, and they may have a weapon type that does more damage. They're encouraged to bring three. They're sometimes punished, but not too much, for bringing only one damage type. And I feel like that mechanic would play pretty well. I've actually been doing that in my own game because I think it sounds fun and it's not too obtrusive. It's not too punishing if the players don't always do it. But that seems like something that 5th edition kind of does a half measure, and it would be not bad if it did more. Again, I'd argue that the variety of weapons in 5th edition, the variety of damage types in 5th edition, warrants that mattering more, or there should just be less of them. Like you can sort of pick one. Remove physical damage types and maybe condense some elemental damage types, or make them matter. Like at the moment, 5th edition kind of just doesn't do either enough. There are enemies that have physical and magical resistances. I just personally think it's few enough that it feels kind of like a trick when it comes up, rather than something you expect in the game. When we talk about a lot of enemies resist fire, for example, but not a lot, just more than resist other elements, like relatively more, but not very many. Like it still basically doesn't matter. It's just technically worse than for other elements. Like maybe it could just matter. For what it's worth, I do also think this is a great balancing mechanic in the game. A lot of fire magic, for example, is among the straightforwardly more powerful magic available to an offensive spellcaster. Your fireball, your scorching ray, those are what come to mind. Those are very, high on the list, top pick spells. So making more enemies resist them, meaning you get higher damage in general, but an amount of the time that matters, enemies don't take full damage from them. That seems good. Like, why is that bad? That just doesn't seem bad. And then the player can choose big bongo damage, but sometimes enemies resist it, and then that feat that makes them ignore damage resistance, that's better. Or they can pick more reliable damage, and that feels like an actual choice instead of just, this is basically better. It isn't better an amount of times so small that you won't ever remember. It might not even ever come up when you play. That just seems like a disadvantageous design. It doesn't do anything. It's not bad if you don't want that, but it doesn't seem advantageous to even focus on damage types as much as 5th edition does, if they matter as little as they do. That just seems why, And again, I think the answer the game designers aren't going to tell you is that they want to please everyone. They want enough monsters that you could sort of just put all the enemies that do resist those damage types in the way of your players if you want that kind of game. But if you don't want that kind of game, it will come up little enough that it basically isn't a mechanic, while still allowing them to kind of make it be a mechanic, which I would argue is the worst of both sides. If you're going to do it that way, I could just make up my own game. Like, the game should be one thing or another if it's going to be useful to the players, but it's not trying to be useful to the players, it's trying to be a marketing thing. 5th edition. Now, again, I'm not saying that makes it not useful. I'm saying that this is a great parlay question to ask because you are making the little changes to the game that probably suit your playgroup. So I hope that this was a snarky enough perspective on 5th edition game design, being kind of like not game design, that encourages you to do these things if you think they'd be a good fit. I think that I kind of felt like I sounded in this parlay like I was saying these are bad by default, but maybe good. But what I meant by that is these are particular game design decisions, which are bad by default if they don't fit the players, but are probably good if they fit your players. Like, having it be specific to your playgroup is great. Like, that's the point. It being bad in general is irrelevant. Like, we're not talking in general. We're talking about your game. So I don't think most players would find these a suitable fit for their game, but that doesn't matter. Like, it just means I don't think they're a great idea in general, but that you don't have to worry about that. Are they balanced in general? I actually think so, but it doesn't matter. You should, are they for your game? I would say. And I think this 5th edition being not very particular is the least problem when you are designing your own stuff, because the game isn't doing too much to resist any way you want it to be. That's sort of the problem. But as long as you're adding stuff, then, well, it will feel specifically your way. You can kind of flavor it your way. So, yeah, these were interesting. I like the trick weapons from Bloodborne. I actually really enjoy the idea of them being transforming. I think you did it in an elegant way where I can really imagine like doing the transformation and then you do an attack with it. That's very cool. Like, that captures the imagination for me. I'm quite keen on using something like these myself. So thanks for the question. Thanks for the homebrew suggestion.